Chapter 3. Fog closed around us like a blindfold. When the captain announced that we were nearly there, at first I thought he was kidding. All I could see from the ferry's rolling deck was an endless curtain of gray. I clutched the rail and stared into the green waves, contemplating the fish who might soon be enjoying my breakfast, while my father stood shivering beside me in shirt sleeves. It was colder and wetter than I'd ever known June could be. I hoped for his sake and mine that the grueling 36 hours we'd braved to get this far, 3 airplanes, 2 layovers, shift napping in grubby train stations, and now this interminable gut-churning ferry ride would pay off. Then my father shouted, "Look!" and I raised my head to see a towering mountain of rock emerge from the blank canvas before us. It was my grandfather's island, looming and bleak, folded in mist, guarded by a million screeching birds. It looked like some ancient fortress constructed by giants. As I gazed up at its sheer cliffs, tops disappearing in a reef of ghostly clouds, the idea that this was a magical place didn't seem so ridiculous. My nausea seemed to vanish. Dad ran around like a kid on Christmas, his eyes glued to the birds wheeling above us. "Jacob, look at that," he cried, pointing to a cluster of airborne specks. "Manx shearwaters." As we drew nearer the cliffs, I began to notice odd shapes lurking underwater. A passing crewman caught me leaning over the rail to stare at them and said, "Never seen a shipwreck before, huh?" I turned to him. "Really?" "This whole area is a nautical graveyard. It's like the old captains used to say. Twixt Heartland Point and Cairnholm Bay is a sailor's grave by night or day." Just then, we passed a wreck that was so near the surface, the outline of its greening carcass so clear, that it looked like it was about to rise out of the water like a zombie from a shallow grave. "See that one?" he said, pointing at it. "Sunk by a U-boat, she was." "There were U-boats around here?" "Loads. Whole Irish Sea was rotten with German subs. Wager you'd have to have half a navy on your hands if you could unsink all the ships they torpedoed." He arched one eyebrow dramatically, then walked off laughing. I jogged along the deck to the stern, tracking the shipwreck as it disappeared beneath our wake. Then, just as I was starting to wonder if we'd need climbing gear to get onto the island, its steep cliffs sloped down to meet us. We rounded a headland to enter a rocky half-moon bay. In the distance, I saw a little harbor bobbing with colorful fishing boats, and beyond it, a town set into a green bowl of land. A patchwork of sheep-speckled fields spread across hills that rose away to meet a high ridge, where a wall of clouds stood like a cotton parapet. It was dramatic and beautiful, unlike any place I'd seen. I felt a little thrill of adventure as we chugged into the bay, as if I were sighting land where maps had noted only a sweep of undistinguished blue. The ferry docked, and we humped our bags into the little town. Upon closer inspection, I decided it was, like a lot of things, not as pretty up close as it seemed from a distance. Whitewashed cottages, quaint except for the satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs, lined a small grid of muddy gravel streets. Because Cairnholm was too distant and too inconsequential to justify the cost of running power lines from the mainland, foul-smelling diesel generators buzzed on every corner like angry wasps, harmonizing with the growl of tractors, the island's only vehicular traffic. At the edges of town, ancient-looking cottages stood abandoned and roofless, evidence of a shrinking population. Children lured away from centuries-old fishing and farming traditions by more glamorous opportunities elsewhere. We dragged our stuff through town, looking for something called the Priest Home, where my dad had booked a room. I pictured an old church converted into a bed and breakfast. Nothing fancy, just somewhere to sleep when we weren't watching birds or chasing down leads. We asked a few locals for directions, but only got confused looks in return. They speak English, right? My dad wondered aloud. Just as my hand was beginning to ache from the unreasonable weight of my suitcase, we came upon a church. We thought we'd found our accommodations until we went inside and saw that it had indeed been converted, but into a dingy little museum, not a B&B. We found the part-time curator in a room hung with old fishing nets and sheep shears. His face lit up when he saw us, then fell when he realized we were only lost. I reckon you're after the priest hole, he said. It's got the only rooms to let on the island. He proceeded to give us directions in a lilting accent, which I found enormously entertaining. I loved hearing Welsh people talk, even if half of what they said was incomprehensible to me. My dad thanked the man and turned to go, but he'd been so helpful, I hung back to ask him another question. Where can we find the old children's home? The old what? He said, squinting at me. For an awful moment, I was afraid we'd come to the wrong island, or worse yet, that the home was just another thing my grandfather had invented. It was a home for refugee kids, I said, during the war, a big house. The man chewed his lip and regarded me doubtfully, as if deciding whether to help or to wash his hands of the whole thing. But he took pity on me. I don't know about any refugees, he said, but I think I know the place you mean. It's way up on the other side of the island, past the bog and through the woods. Though I wouldn't go mucking about up there alone if I was you. Stray too far from the path, and that's the last anyone will hear of you. Nothing but wet grass and sheep patties to keep you from going straight over a cliff. That's good to know, my dad said, eyeing me. Promise you won't go by yourself. All right. What's your interest in it anyhow? The man said. It's not exactly on the tourist maps. Just a little genealogy project, my father replied, lingering near the door. My dad spent a few years there as a kid. I could tell he was eager to avoid any mention of psychiatrists or dead grandfathers. He thanked the man again and quickly ushered me out the door. Following the curator's directions, we retraced our steps until we came to a grim-looking statue carved from black stone, a memorial called the Waiting Woman, dedicated to islanders lost at sea. She wore a pitiful expression and stood with arms outstretched in the direction of the harbor, many blocks away, but also toward the priest's hole, which was directly across the street. Now, I'm no hotel connoisseur, but one glance at the weathered sign told me that our stay was unlikely to be a 4-star mince-on-your-pillow type of experience. Printed in giant script at the top was wines, ales, spirits. Below that, in more modest lettering, fine food. Handwritten along the bottom, clearly an afterthought, was rooms to let, though the S had been struck out, leaving just the singular room. As we lugged our bags toward the door, my father grumbling about conmen and false advertising, I glanced back at the waiting woman and wondered if she wasn't just waiting for someone to bring her a drink. We squeezed our bags through the doorway and stood blinking in the sudden gloom of a low-ceilinged pub. When my eyes had adjusted, I realized that hole was a pretty accurate description of the place. Tiny, leaded windows admitted just enough light to find the beer tap without tripping over tables and chairs on the way. The tables, worn and wobbling, looked like they might be more useful as firewood. The bar was half filled, at whatever hour of the morning it was, with men in various states of hushed intoxication, heads bowed prayerfully over tumblers of amber liquid. You must be after the room, said the man behind the bar, coming out to shake our hands. I'm Kev, and these are the fellas. Say hello, fellas. Hello, they muttered, nodding at their drinks. We followed Kev up a narrow staircase to a suite of rooms, plural, that could charitably be described as basic. There were 2 bedrooms, the larger of which Dad claimed, and a room that tripled as a kitchen, dining room, and living room, meaning that it contained 1 table, 1 moth-eaten sofa, and 1 hot plate. The bathroom worked most of the time, according to Kev, but if it ever gets dicey, there's always Old Reliable. He directed our attention to a portable toilet in the alley out back, conveniently visible from my bedroom window. "Oh, and you'll need these," he said, fetching a pair of oil lamps from a cabinet. "The generators stop running at 10 since petrol's so bloody expensive to ship out, so either you get to bed early or you learn to love candles and kerosene." He grinned. "Hope it ain't too medieval for you." We assured Kev that outhouses and kerosene would be just fine. Sounded like fun, in fact. A little adventure, yes sir. And then he led us downstairs for the final leg of our tour. "You're welcome to take your meals here," he said, "and I expect you will, on account of there's nowhere else to eat. If you need to make a call, we have a phone box in the corner there. Sometimes there's a bit of a queue for it, though, since we get doodly for mobile reception out here, and you're looking at the only landline on the island. That's right, we got it all. Only food, only bed, only phone." And he leaned back and laughed long and loud. The only phone on the island. I looked over at it. It was the kind that you had a door that you could pull shut for privacy, like the ones you see in old movies, and realized with dawning horror that this was the Grecian orgy. This was the raging frat party I had been connected to when I called the island a few weeks ago. This was the piss hole. Kev handed my dad the keys to our rooms. "Any questions?" he said. "You know where to find me." "I have a question," I said. What's a priest hole?" The men at the bar burst into laughter. "Why, it's a hole for priests, of course," one said, which made the rest of them laugh even harder. Kev walked over to an uneven patch of floorboards next to the fireplace, where a mangy dog lay sleeping. "Right here," he said, tapping what appeared to be a door in the floor with a shoe. "Ages ago, when just being a Catholic could get you hung from a tree, clergy folk came here seeking refuge. If Queen Elizabeth's crew of thugs came chasing after, we hid whoever needed hiding in snug little spots like this. Priest holes." It struck me the way he said "we," as if he'd known those long-dead islanders personally. "Snug indeed," one of the drinkers said. "Bet they were warm as toast and tight as drums down there." "I'd take warm and snug to strung up by priest killers any day," said another. "Hear, hear," the first man said. "To Cairnholm. May she always be our rock of refuge." "To Cairnholm," they chorused, and raised their glasses together. Jet-lagged and exhausted, we went to sleep early, or rather, we went to our beds and lay in them, with pillows covering our heads, to block out the thumping cacophony that issued through the floorboards, which grew so loud that at one point I thought surely the revelers had invaded my room. Then the clock must have struck 10, because all at once the buzzing generators outside sputtered and died, as did the music from downstairs, and the streetlight that had been shining through my window. Suddenly, I was cocooned in silent, blissful darkness, with only the whisper of distant waves to remind me where I was. For the first time in months, I fell into a deep, nightmare-free slumber. I dreamed instead about my grandfather as a boy, about his first night here, a stranger in a strange land, under a strange roof, owing his life to people who spoke a strange tongue. When I awoke, sun streaming through my window, I realized it wasn't just my grandfather's life that Miss Peregrine had saved, but mine too, and my father's. Today, with any luck, I could finally get to thank her. I went downstairs to find my dad already bellied up to the table, slurping coffee and polishing his fancy binoculars. Just as I sat down, Kev appeared, bearing 2 plates loaded with mystery meat and fried toast. "I didn't know you could fry toast," I remarked, to which Kev replied that there wasn't a food he was aware of that couldn't be improved by frying. Over breakfast, Dad and I discussed our plan for the day. It was to be a kind of scout, to familiarize ourselves with the island. We'd scope out my dad's bird-watching spots first, and then find the children's home. I scarfed my food, anxious to get started. Well fortified with grease, we left the pub and walked through town, dodging tractors and shouting to each other over the din of generators, until the streets gave way to fields and the noise faded behind us. It was a crisp and blustery day, the sun hiding behind giant cloud banks, only to burst out moments later and dapple the hills with spectacular rays of light, and I felt energized and hopeful. We were heading for a rocky beach where my dad had spotted a bunch of birds from the ferry. I wasn't sure how we would reach it, though. The island was slightly bowl-shaped, with hills that climbed toward its edges, only to drop off at precarious seaside cliffs. But at this particular spot, the edge had been rounded off, and a path led down to a minor spit of sand along the water. We picked our way down to the beach, where what seemed to be an entire civilization of birds were flapping and screeching and fishing in tide pools. I watched my father's eyes widen. "Fascinating," he muttered, scraping at some petrified guano with the stubby end of his pen. "I'm going to need some time here. Is that all right?" I'd seen this look on his face before, and I knew exactly what some time meant. Hours and hours. "Then I'll go find the house by myself," I said. "Not alone you aren't, you promised." "Then I'll find a person who can take me." "Who?" "Kev will know someone." My dad looked out to sea, where a big rusted lighthouse jutted up from a pile of rocks. "You know what the answer would be if your mom were here," he said. My parents had differing theories about how much parenting I required. Mom was the enforcer, always hovering, but Dad hung back a little. He thought it was important that I make my own mistakes now and then. Also, letting me would free him to play with guano all day. "Okay," he said, "but make sure you leave the number of whoever you go with." "Dad, nobody here has phones." He sighed. "Right. Well, as long as they're reliable." Kev was out running an errand, and because asking one of his drunken regulars to chaperone me seemed like a bad idea, I went into the nearest shop to ask someone who was at least gainfully employed. The door read fishmonger. I pushed it open to find myself cowering before a bearded giant in a blood-soaked apron. He left off decapitating fish to glare at me, dripping cleaver in hand, and I vowed never again to discriminate against the intoxicated. "What the hell for?" he growled when I told him where I wanted to go. "Nothing over there but bogland and balmy weather." I explained about my grandfather and the children's home. He frowned at me, then leaned over the counter to cast a doubtful glance at my shoes. "I suppose Dylan ain't too busy to take you," he said, pointing his cleaver at a kid about my age who was arranging fish in a freezer case. "But you'll be wanting proper footwear. Wouldn't do to let you go in them trainers. Mud'll suck 'em right off." "Really?" I said. "Are you sure?" "Dylan, fetch our man here a pail of Wellingtons." The kid groaned and made a big show of slowly closing the freezer case and cleaning his hands before slouching over to a wall of shelves packed with dry goods. "Just so happens we've got some sturdy good boots on offer," the fishmonger said. "Buy one, get none free." He burst out laughing and slammed his cleaver on a salmon, its head shooting across the blood-slicked counter to land perfectly in a little guillotine bucket. I fished the emergency money Dad had given me from my pocket, figuring that a little extortion was a small price to pay to find the woman I'd crossed the Atlantic to meet. I left the shop wearing a pair of rubber boots so large my sneakers fit inside, and so heavy it was difficult to keep up with my begrudging guide. "So, do you go to school on the island?" I asked Dylan, scurrying to catch up. I was genuinely curious. What was living here like for someone my age? He muttered the name of a town on the mainland. "What is that, an hour each way by ferry?" "Yep." And that was it. He responded to further attempts at conversation with even fewer syllables, which is to say, none. So finally, I just gave up and followed him. On the way out of town, we ran into one of his friends, an older boy wearing a blinding yellow tracksuit and fake gold chains. He couldn't have looked more out of place on Cairnholm if he'd been dressed like an astronaut. He gave Dylan a fist bump and introduced himself as Worm. Worm? It's his stage name, Dylan explained. "We're the sickest rapping duo in Wales," Worm said. "I'm MC Worm, and this is the Sturgeon Surgeon, a.k.a. MC Dirty Dylan, a.k.a. MC Dirty Business, Cairnholm's #1 beatboxer. Want to show this Yank how we do, Dirty D?" Dylan looked annoyed. "Now? Drop some next-level beats, son." Dylan rolled his eyes, but did as he was asked. At first, I thought he was choking on his tongue, except there was a rhythm to his sputtering coughs, over which Worm began to rap. "I likes to get wrecked up down at the priest hole. Your dad's always there 'cause he's on the dole. My rhymes is tight, yeah, I make it look easy. Dylan's beats are hot like chicken jalfrezi." Dylan stopped. "That doesn't even make sense," he said. "And it's your dad who's on the dole." "Oh shit, Dirty D let the beat drop." Worm started beatboxing while doing a passable robot, his sneakers twisting holes in the gravel. "Take the mic, D." Dylan seemed embarrassed, but let the rhymes fly anyway. "I met a tight bird, and her name was Sharon. She was keen on my tracksuit and the trainers I was wearing. I showed her the time like Doctor Who. I thunk up this rhyme while I was in the loo." Worm shook his head. "The loo?" "I wasn't ready." They turned to me and asked what I thought. Considering that they didn't even like each other's rapping, I wasn't sure what to say. I guess I'm more into music with, like, singing and guitars and stuff. Worm dismissed me with a wave of his hand. "He wouldn't know a dope rhyme if it bit him in the bollocks," he muttered. Dylan laughed, and they exchanged a series of complex, multi-stage handshake fist bump high fives. "Can we go now?" I said. They grumbled and dawdled a while longer, but pretty soon we were on our way, this time with Worm tagging along. I took up the rear, trying to figure out what I would say to Miss Peregrine when I met her. I was expecting to be introduced to a proper Welsh lady and sip tea in the parlor and make polite small talk until the time seemed right to break the bad news. "I'm Abraham Portman's grandson," I would say. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but he's been taken from us." Then, once she finished quietly dabbing away tears, I would ply her with questions. I followed Dylan and Worm along a path that wound through pastures of grazing sheep before a long, busting ascent up a ridge. At the top hovered an embankment of rolling, snaking fog so dense it was like stepping into another world. It was truly biblical. A fog I could imagine God is in one of his lesser wraths cursing the Egyptians with. As we descended the other side, it only seemed to thicken. The sun faded to a pale white bloom. Moisture clung to everything, beating on my skin and dampening my clothes. The temperature dropped. I lost Worm and Dylan for a moment, and then the path flattened and I came upon them just standing, waiting for me. "Yank boy," Dylan called. "This way." I followed obediently. We abandoned the path to plow through a field of marshy grass. Sheep stared at us with big, leaky eyes, their wool soggy and tails drooping. A small house appeared out of the mist. It was all boarded up. "You sure this is it?" I said. "It looks empty." "Empty? No way. There's loads of shit in there," Worm replied. "Go on," said Dylan. "Have a look." I had a feeling it was a trick, but stepped up to the door and knocked anyway. It was unlatched and opened a little at my touch. It was too dark to see inside, so I took a step through, and to my surprise down, into what looked like a dirt floor, but I quickly realized was in fact a shin-deep ocean of excrement. This tenantless hovel, so innocent looking from the outside, was really a makeshift sheep stable, quite literally a shithole. "Oh my God," I squealed in disgust. Peals of laughter exploded from outside. I stumbled backward through the door before the smell could knock me unconscious, and found the boys doubled over holding their stomachs. "You guys are assholes," I said, stomping the muck off my boots. "Why?" said Worm. "We told you it was full of shit." I got in Dylan's face. "Are you going to show me the house or not?" "He's serious," said Worm, wiping tears from his eyes. "Of course I'm serious." Dylan's smile faded. "I thought you were taking the piss, mate." "Taking a what?" "Joking, like." "Well, I wasn't." The boys exchanged an uneasy look. Dylan whispered something to Worm. Worm whispered something back. Finally, Dylan turned and pointed up the path. "If you really want to see it," he said, "keep going past the bog and through the woods. It's a big old place. You can't miss it." "What the hell? You're supposed to go with me." Worm looked away and said, "This is as far as we go." "Why?" "It just is." And they turned and began to trudge back the way we'd come, receding into the fog. I weighed my options. I could tuck tail and follow my tormentors back to town, or I could go ahead alone and lie to Dad about it. After 4 seconds of intense deliberation, I was on my way. A vast lunar bog stretched away into the mist from either side of the path, just brown grass and tea-colored water as far as I could see. Featureless, but for the occasional mound of piled-up stones. It ended abruptly at a forest of skeletal trees, branches spindling up the tips of wet-painted brushes, and for a while, the path became so lost beneath fallen trunks and carpets of ivy that navigating it was a matter of faith. I wondered how an elderly person like Miss Peregrine would ever be able to negotiate such an obstacle course. She must get deliveries, I thought, though the path looked like it hadn't seen a footprint in months, if not years. I scrambled over a giant trunk slick with moss, and the path took a sharp turn. The trees parted like a curtain, and suddenly, there it was, cloaked in fog, looming atop a weak-choked hill. The house. I understood at once why the boys had refused to come. My father had described it 100 times, but in his stories, the house was always a bright, happy place, big and rambling. yes, but full of light and laughter. What stood before me now was no refuge from monsters, but a monster itself, staring down from its perch on the hill with vacant hunger. Trees burst forth from broken windows, and skins of scabrous vine gnawed at the walls like antibodies attacking a virus, as if nature itself had waged war against it. But the house seemed unkillable, resolutely upright despite the wrongness of its angles, and the jagged teeth of sky visible through sections of collapsed roof. I tried to convince myself that it was possible someone could live there, run down as it was. Such things weren't unheard of where I came from. A falling down wreck on the edge of town, curtains permanently drawn, that would turn out to have been home to some ancient recluse who'd been surviving on ramen and toenail clippings since some time immemorial, though no one realizes it until a property appraiser or an overly ambitious census taker barges in to find the poor soul returning to dust in a lazy boy. People get too old to care for a place. Their family writes them off for one reason or another. It's sad, but it happens. Which meant, like it or not, that I was going to have to knock. I gathered what scrawny courage I had and waded through waist-high weeds to the porch, all broken tile and rotting wood, to peek through a cracked window. All I could make out through the smeared glass were the outlines of furniture, so I knocked on the door and stood back to wait in the eerie silence, tracing the shape of Miss Peregrine's letter in my pocket. I'd taken it along in case I needed to prove who I was, but as a minute ticked by, then 2, it seemed less and less likely that I would need it. Climbing down into the yard, I circled the house looking for another way in, taking the measure of the place, but it seemed almost without measure, as though with every corner I turned, the house sprouted new balconies and turrets and chimneys. Then I came around back and saw my opportunity. A doorless doorway, bearded with vines, gaping and black, an open mouth just waiting to swallow me. Just looking at it made my skin crawl, but I hadn't come halfway around the world just to run away screaming at the sight of a scary house. I thought of all the horrors Grandpa Portman had faced in his life, and I felt my resolve harden. If there was anyone to find inside, I would find them. I mounted the crumbling steps and crossed the threshold. Standing in a tomb-dark hallway, just inside the door, I stared frozenly at what looked for all the world like skins hanging from hooks. After a queasy moment in which I imagined some twisted cannibal leaping from the shadows with knife in hand, I realized they were only coats rotted to rags and green with age. I shuddered involuntarily and took a deep breath. I'd only explored 10 feet of the house and was already about to foul my underwear. Keep it together, I told myself, and then slowly moved forward, heart hammering in my chest. Each room was a disaster more incredible than the last. Newspapers gathered in drifts, scattered toys, evidence of children long gone, lay skinned in dust. Creeping mold had turned window-adjacent walls black and furry. Fireplaces were throttled with vines that had descended from the roof and begun to spread across the floors like alien tentacles. The kitchen was a science experiment gone terribly wrong. Entire shelves of jarred food had exploded from 60 seasons of freezing and thawing, splattered the wall with evil-looking stains. And fallen plaster lay so thickly over the dining room floor that for a moment I thought it had snowed indoors. At the end of a light-starved corridor, I tested my weight on a rickety staircase, my boots leaving fresh tracks in layers of dust. The steps groaned as if woken from a long sleep. If anyone was upstairs, they'd been there for a very long time. Finally, I came upon a pair of rooms missing entire walls, into which a little forest of underbrush and stunted trees had grown. I stood in the sudden breeze, wondering what could possibly have done that kind of damage, and began to get the feeling that something terrible had happened here. I couldn't square my grandfather's idyllic stories with this nightmare house, nor the idea that he'd found refuge here, with the sense of disaster that pervaded it. There was more left to explore, but suddenly it seemed like a waste of time. It was impossible that anyone could still be living here, even the most misanthropic recluse. I left the house feeling like I was further than ever from the truth. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Once I'd hopped and tripped and felt my way like a blind man through the woods and fog and reemerged into the world of sun and light, I was surprised to find the sun sinking and the light going red. Somehow, the whole day had slipped away. At the pub, my dad was waiting for me, a black-as-night beer and his open laptop on the table in front of him. I sat down and swiped his beer before he'd had a chance to even look up from typing. "Oh, my sweet Lord," I sputtered, choking down a mouthful. "What is this? Fermented motor oil?" "Just about," he said, laughing, and then snatched it back. "It's not like American beer. Not that you'd know what that tastes like, right?" "Absolutely not," I said with a wink, even though it was true. My dad liked to believe I was as popular and adventuresome as he was at my age, a myth that had always seemed easiest to perpetuate. I underwent a brief interrogation about how I'd gotten to the house and who had taken me there, and because the easiest kind of lying is when you leave things out of a story rather than make them up, I passed with flying colors. I conveniently forgot to mention that Worm and Dylan had tricked me into wading through sheep excrement and then bailed out a half-mile from our destination. Dad seemed pleased that I'd already managed to meet a couple kids my own age. I guess I also forgot to mention the part about them hating me. "So how was the house?" "Trashed." He winced. "Guess it's been a long time since our grandpa lived there, huh?" "Yeah, or anyone." He closed the laptop, a sure sign I was about to receive his full attention. "I can see you're disappointed." "Well, I didn't come thousands of miles looking for a house full of creepy garbage." "So what are you going to do?" "Find people to talk to. Someone will know what happened to the kids who used to live there. I figure a few of them must still be alive, on the mainland if not around here, in a nursing home or something." "Sure, that's an idea." He didn't sound convinced, though. There was an odd pause, and then he said, "So, do you feel like you're starting to get a better handle on who your grandpa was, being here?" I thought about it. "I don't know. I guess so. It's just an island, you know." He nodded. "Exactly. What about you?" "Me?" He shrugged. "I gave up trying to understand my father a long time ago." "That's sad. Weren't you interested?" "Sure I was. Then, after a while, I wasn't anymore." I could feel the conversation going in a direction I wasn't entirely comfortable with, but I persisted anyway. "Why not?" "When someone won't let you in, eventually you stop knocking. Know what I mean?" He hardly ever talked like this. Maybe it was the beer, or that we were so far from home, or maybe he decided I was finally old enough to hear this stuff. Whatever the reason, I didn't want him to stop. "But he was your dad. How could you just give up?" "It wasn't me who gave up," he said a little too loudly, then looked down, embarrassed, and swirled the beer in his glass. "It's just that, the truth is, I think your grandpa didn't know how to be a dad, but he felt like he had to be one anyway. Because None of his brothers or sisters survived the war. So he dealt with it by being gone all the time, on hunting trips, business trips, you name it. And even when he was around, it was like he wasn't. Is this about that one Halloween? What are you talking about? You know, from the picture. It was an old story, and it went like this. It was Halloween. My dad was 4 or 5 years old and had never been trick-or-treating. And Grandpa Portman had promised to take him when he got off work. My grandmother had bought my dad this ridiculous pink bunny costume, and he put it on and sat by the driveway waiting for Grandpa Portman to come home from 5 o'clock until nightfall. But he never did. Grandma was so mad that she took a picture of my dad crying in the street just so she could show my grandfather what a huge asshole he was. Needless to say, that picture has been long an object of legend among members of my family and a great embarrassment to my father. It was a lot more than just one Halloween, he grumbled. Really, Jake, you were closer to him than I ever was. I don't know, there was just something unspoken between the two of you. I didn't know how to respond. Was he jealous of me? Why are you telling me this? Because you're my son, and I don't want you to get hurt. Hurt how? He paused. Outside, the clouds shifted, the last rays of daylight throwing our shadows against the wall. I got a sick feeling in my stomach, like when your parents are about to tell you they're splitting up. But you know it before they even open their mouths. I never dug too deep with your grandpa because I was afraid of what I'd find, he said, finally. You mean about the war? No. Your grandpa kept those secrets because they were painful. I understood that. I mean about the traveling, him being gone all the time, what he was really doing. I think your aunt and I both thought that there was another woman, maybe more than one. I let it hang between us for a moment. My face tangled strangely. That's crazy, Dad. We found a letter once. It was from a woman whose name we didn't know, addressed to your grandfather. I love you. I miss you. When are you coming back? That kind of thing. Seedy, lipstick on the collar type stuff. I'll never forget it. I felt a hot stab of shame, like somehow it was my own crime he was describing, and yet I couldn't quite believe it. We tore up the letter and flushed it down the toilet. Never found another one either. Guess he was more careful after that. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't look at my father. I'm sorry, Jake. This must be hard to hear. I know how much you worshipped him. He reached out to squeeze my shoulder, but I shrugged him off, then scraped back my chair and stood up. I don't worship anyone. Okay, I didn't want you to be surprised, that's all. I grabbed my jacket and slung it over my shoulder. What are you doing? Dinner's on the way. You're wrong about him, I said, and I'm going to prove it. He sighed. It was a letting go kind of sigh. Okay, I hope you do. I slammed out of the priest hole and started walking, heading nowhere in particular. Sometimes you just need to go through a door. It was true, of course, what my dad had said. I did worship my grandfather. There were things about him that I needed to be true, and his being an adulterer was not one of them. When I was a kid, Grandpa Portman's fantastic stories meant it was possible to live a magical life. Even after I stopped believing them, there was still something magical about my grandfather. To have endured all the horrors he did, to have seen the worst of humanity and have your life made unrecognizable by it. To come out of all that, the honorable and good and brave person I knew him to be. That was magical. So I couldn't believe he was a liar and a cheater and a bad father. Because if Grandpa Portman wasn't honorable and good, I wasn't sure anyone could be. The museum's doors were open, and its lights were on, but no one seemed to be inside. I'd gone there to find the curator, hoping he knew a thing or two about the island's history and people, and could shed some light on the empty house and the whereabouts of its former inhabitants. Figuring he'd just stepped out for a minute, the crowds weren't exactly kicking down his door. I wandered into the sanctuary to kill time, checking out museum displays. The exhibits, such as they were arranged in big, open-fronted cabinets that lined the walls and stood where pews had once been. For the most part, they were unspeakably boring, all about life in a traditional fishing village and the enduring mysteries of animal husbandry. But one exhibit stood out from the rest. It was in a place of honor at the front of the room, in a fancy case that rested atop what had been the altar. It lived behind a rope I stepped over and a little warning sign I didn't bother to read. And its case had polished wooden sides and a plexiglass top so you could only see into it from above. When I looked inside, I think I actually gasped. And for one panicky second thought, monster. Because I had suddenly and unexpectedly come face to face with a blackened corpse. Its shrunken body bore an uncanny resemblance to the creatures that had haunted my dreams, as did the color of its flesh, which was like something that had been spit roasted over a flame. But when the body failed to come alive and scar my mind forever by breaking the glass and going for my jugular, my initial panic subsided. It was just a museum display, albeit an excessively morbid one. "I see you've met the old man," called a voice from behind me, and I turned to see the curator striding in my direction. "You handled it pretty well. I've seen grown men faint dead right away." He grinned and reached out to shake my hand. "Martin Paget. Don't believe I caught your name the other day." "Jacob Portman," I said. "Who's this? Wales' most famous murder victim?" "Ha, well, he might be that too, though I never thought of him that way. He's our island's senior-most resident, better known in archaeological circles as Cairnholm Man. Though to us, he's just the old man. More than 2,700 years old, to be exact, though he was only 16 when he died. So he's rather a young old man, really." 2,700, I said, glancing at the dead boy's face, his delicate features somehow perfectly preserved. But he looks so... That's what happens when you spend your golden years in a place where oxygen and bacteria can't exist. Like the underside of our bog. It's a regular fountain of youth down there, provided you're already dead, that is. "That's where you found him? The bog?" He laughed. "Not me. Turf cutters did, digging for peat by the big stone cairn out there, back in the 70s. He looked so fresh they thought there might be a killer loose on Cairnholm, till the cops had a look at the Stone Age bow in his hand and the noose of human hair around his neck. They didn't make him like that anymore." I shuddered. Sounds like a human sacrifice or something. Exactly. He was done in by a combination of strangulation, drowning, disembowelment, and a blow to the head. Seems rather like overkill, don't you think? "I guess so." Martin roared with laughter. "He guesses so." "Okay, yeah, it does." "Sure it does. But the really fascinating thing, to us modern folk anyway, is that in all likelihood, the boy went to his death willingly, eagerly even. His people believed that bogs, and our bog in particular, were entrances to the world of the gods, and so the perfect place to offer up their most precious gift, themselves. That's insane. I suppose. Though I imagine we're killing ourselves right now in all manner of ways that'll seem insane to people in the future. And as doors to the next world go, a bog ain't a bad choice. It's not quite water and it's not quite land. It's an in-between place. He bent over the case, studying the figure inside. Ain't he beautiful? I looked at the body again, throttled and flayed and drowned and somehow made immortal in the process. I don't think so, I said. Martin straightened, then began to speak in a grandiose tone. Come you and gaze upon the tar man. Blackly he reposes, tender face the color of soot, withered limbs like veins of coal, feet lumps of driftwood hung with shriveled grapes. He threw his arms out like a hammy stage actor and began to strut around the case. Come you and bear witness to the cruel art of his wounds, pearled and meandering lines drawn by knives, brain and bone exposed by stones, the rope still digging at his throat. First fruit slashed and dumped, seeker of heaven, old man arrested in youth. I almost love you. He took a theatrical bow as I applauded. Wow, I said, did you write that? Guilty, he replied with a sheepish smile. I twiddle about with lines of verse now and then, but it's only a hobby. In any case, thank you for indulging me. I wondered what this odd, well-spoken man was doing on Cairnholm, with his pleated slacks and half-baked poems, looking more like a bank manager than someone who lived on a windswept island with one phone and no paved roads. Now, I'd be happy to show you the rest of my collection, he said, escorting me toward the door, but I'm afraid it's shutting up time. If you'd like to come back tomorrow, however. Actually, I was hoping you might know something, I said, stopping him before he could shoo me out. It's about the house I mentioned this morning. I went to see it. Well, he exclaimed, I thought I'd scared you off it. How's our haunted mansion faring these days? Still standing? I assured him that it was, then got right to the point. The people that lived there, do you have any idea what happened to them? They're dead, he replied. Happened a long time ago. I was surprised, though I probably shouldn't have been. Miss Peregrine was old. Old people die. But that didn't mean my search was over. I'm looking for anyone else who might have lived there too, not just the headmistress. All dead, he repeated. No one's lived there since the war. That took me a moment to process. What do you mean? What war? When we say the war around here, my boy, there's only one that we mean. The second. It was a German air raid that got him, if I'm not mistaken. No, that can't be right. He nodded. In those days, there was an anti-aircraft gun battery at the far tip of the island, past the wood where the house is. It made Cairnholm a legitimate military target. Not that legitimate mattered much to the Germans one way or another, mind you. Anyway, one of the bombs went off track and, well, he shook his head. Nasty luck. That can't be right, I said again, though I was starting to wonder. Why don't you sit down and let me fix you some tea, he said. You look a bit off the mark. Just feeling a little lightheaded. He led me to a chair in his office and went to make the tea. I tried to collect my thoughts. Bombed in the war. That would certainly explain those rooms with blown-out walls, but what about the letter from Miss Peregrine, postmarked Cairnholm, sent just 15 years ago? Martin returned, handing me a mug. There's a nip of penderin in it, he said. Secret recipe, you know. Should get you sorted in no time. I thanked him and took a sip, realizing too late that the secret ingredient was high-test whiskey. It felt like napalm flushing down my esophagus. It does have a certain kick, I admitted, my face going red. He frowned. Reckon I ought to fetch your father. No, I'll be fine, but if there's anything else you can tell me about the attack, I'd be grateful. Martin settled into a chair opposite me. About that, I'm curious. You say your grandfather lived here? He never mentioned it? I'm curious about that too, I said. I guess it must have been after his time. Did it happen late in the war or early? I'm ashamed to admit I don't know. But if you're keen, I can introduce you to someone who does. My Uncle Augie. He's 83, lived here his whole life, still sharp as a tack. Martin glanced at his watch. If we catch him before Father Ted comes on the telly, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to tell you anything you'd like. 10 minutes later, Martin and I were wedged deep in an overstuffed sofa in Augie's living room, which was piled high with books and boxes of worn-out shoes and enough lamps to light up Carlsbad Caverns, all but one of them unplugged. Living on a remote island, I was starting to realize, turned people into pack rats. Augie sat facing us in a threadbare blazer and pajama bottoms, as if he'd been expecting company. Not just pants-worthy company, and rocked endlessly in a plastic-covered easy chair as he talked. He seemed happy just to have an audience, and after he'd gone on at length about the weather and Welsh politics and the sorry state of today's youth, Martin was finally able to steer him around to the attack and the children from the home. Sure, I remember them, he said. Odd collection of people. We'd seen them in town now and again. The children, sometimes their minder woman too, buying milk and medicine and what have you. You'd say good morning, and they'd look the other way. Keep to themselves, they did, off in that big house. A lot of talk about what might have been going on over there, though no one knew for sure. What kind of talk? A lot of rot. Like I said, no one knew. All I can say is they weren't your regular sort of orphan children. Not like them Bernardo home kids they got in other places, who you'll see come into town for parades and things and always have time for a chat. This lot was different. Some of them couldn't even speak the king's English, or any English for that matter. Because they weren't really orphans, I said. They were refugees from other countries, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Is that what they were now? Augie said, cocking an eyebrow at me. Funny, I hadn't heard that. He seemed offended, like I'd insulted him by pretending to know more about his island than he did. His chair rocking got faster, more aggressive. If this was the kind of reception my grandpa and the other kids got on Cairnholm, I thought, no wonder they kept to themselves. Martin cleared his throat. So, Uncle, the bombing. Oh, keep your hair on. Yes, the goddamn Jerrys. Who could forget them? He launched into a long-winded description of what life on the island was like under threat of German air raids, the blaring sirens, the panicked scrambles for shelter, the volunteer air raid warden who ran from house to house at night, making sure shades had been drawn and streetlights were put out to rob enemy pilots of easy targets. They prepared as best they could, but never really thought they'd get hit, given all the ports and factories on the mainland, all much more important targets than Cairnholm's little gun emplacement. But one night, the bombs began to fall. The noise was dreadful, Augie said. It was like giants stamping across the island, and it seemed to go on for ages. They gave us a hell of a pounding, though no one in town was killed, thank heaven. Can't say the same for our gunner boys, though. They gave us as good as they got. Nor the poor souls at the orphan home. One bomb was all it took. Gave up their lives for Britain, they did. Wherever they was from, God bless them for that. Do you remember when it happened? I asked. Early in the war or late? I can tell you the exact day, he said. It was the 3rd of September, 1940. The air seemed to go out of the room. I flashed to my grandfather's ashen face, his lips just barely moving, uttering those very words. September 3rd, 1940. Are you sure about that? That it was that day? I never got to fight, he said. Too young by a year. That one night was my whole war. So, yes, I'm sure. I felt numb, disconnected. It was too strange. Was someone playing a joke on me? I wondered. A weird, unfunny joke? And there weren't any survivors at all? Martin asked. The old man thought for a moment, his gaze drifting up to the ceiling. Now that you mention it, he said, I reckon there were. Just one. A young man, not much older than this boy here. His rocking stopped as he remembered it. Walked into the town the morning after with not a scratch upon him. Hardly seemed perturbed at all, considering he'd just seen all his mates go to their reward. It was the queerest thing. He was probably in shock, Martin said. I shouldn't wonder, replied Augie. He spoke only once, to ask my father when the next boat was leaving for the mainland. Said he wanted to take up arms directly and kill the damn monsters who murdered his people. Augie's story was nearly as far-fetched as the ones Grandpa Portman used to tell, and yet I had no reason to doubt him. I knew him, I said. He was my grandfather. They looked at me astonished. Well, Billy said, I'll be blessed. I excused myself and stood up. Martin, remarking that I seemed out of sorts, offered to walk me back to the pub, but I declined. I needed to be alone with my thoughts. Come and see me soon then, he said, and I promised I would. I took the long way back, past the swaying lights of the harbor, the air heavy with brine and with chimney smoke from 100 hearth fires. I walked to the end of a dock and watched the moon rise over the water, imagining my grandfather standing there on that awful morning after, numb with shock, waiting for a boat that would take him away from all the death he'd endured, to war and more death. There was no escaping the monsters, not even on this island. No bigger on a map than a grain of sand, protected by mountains of fog and sharp rocks and seething tides. Not anywhere. That was the awful truth my grandfather had tried to protect me from. In the distance, I heard the generator sputter and spin down, and all the lights along the harbor and in-house windows behind me surged for a moment before going dark. I imagined how such a thing might look from an airplane's height, the whole island suddenly winking out, as if it had never been there at all. A supernova in miniature. I walked back by moonlight, feeling small. I found my dad in the pub at the same table where he'd been, a half-eaten plate of beef and gravy congealed into grease before him. Look who's back, he said, as I sat down. I saved your dinner for you. I'm not hungry, I said, and told him what I'd learned about Grandpa Portman. He seemed more angry than surprised. I can't believe he never brought this up, he said. Not one time. I could understand his anger. It was one thing for a grandparent to withhold something like that from a grandchild, quite another for a father to keep it from his son, and for so long. I tried to steer the conversation in a more positive direction. It's amazing, isn't it? Everything he went through? My father nodded. I don't think we'll ever know the full extent of it. Grandpa Portman really knew how to keep a secret, didn't he? Are you kidding? The man was an emotional Fort Knox. I wonder if it doesn't explain something, though. Why he acted so distant when you were little. Dad gave me a sharp look, and I knew I needed to make my point quickly or risk overstepping. He'd already lost his family twice before. Once in Poland and then again here, his adopted family. So when you and Aunt Susie came along, once bombed, twice shy. I'm serious. Don't you think this could mean that maybe he wasn't cheating on Grandma after all? I don't know, Jake. I guess I don't believe things are ever that simple. He let out a sigh, breath fogging the insides of his beer glass. I think I know what all this really explains, though. Why you and Grandpa were so close. Okay. It took him 50 years to get over his fear of having a family. You came along at just the right time. I didn't know how to respond. How do you say, "I'm sorry your father didn't love you enough," to your own dad? I couldn't, so instead I just said goodnight and headed upstairs to bed. I tossed and turned most of the night. I couldn't stop thinking about the letters. The one my dad and Aunt Susie had found as kids from this other woman, and the one I'd found a month ago from Miss Peregrine. The thought that kept me awake was this: what if they were the same woman? The postmark on Miss Peregrine's letter was 15 years old, but by all accounts, she'd been blown into the stratosphere back in 1940. So, to my mind, that left two possible explanations. Either my grandfather had been corresponding with a dead person, admittedly unlikely, or the person who wrote the letter was not, in fact, Miss Peregrine, but someone who was using her identity to disguise her own. Why would you disguise your identity in a letter? Because you have something to hide. Because you are the other woman. What if the only thing I had discovered on this trip was that my grandfather was an adulterous liar? In his last breaths, was he trying to tell me about the death of his adopted family? Or admit to some tawdry, decades-long affair? Maybe it was both. And the truth was, by this time, he was a young man. He'd had his family torn apart so many times, he no longer knew how to have one, or to be faithful to one. It was all just guesswork, though. I didn't know, and there was no one to ask. Anyone who might have had the answer was long dead. In less than 24 hours, the whole trip had become pointless. I fell into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, I woke to the sound of something in my room. Rolling over to see what it was, I bolted upright in bed. A large bird was perched on my dresser, staring me down. It had a sleek head, feathered and gray, and talons that clacked on the wooden dresser as it sidled back and forth along the edge, as if to get a better look at me. I stared back rigidly, wondering if this could be a dream. I called out for my dad, and at the sound of my voice, the bird launched itself off the dresser. I threw my arm across my face and rolled away, and when I peeked again, it was gone, flown out the open window. My dad stumbled in, bleary-eyed. "What's going on?" I showed him the talon marks on the dresser and a feather that had landed on the floor. "God, that's weird," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Peregrines almost never come this close to humans." I thought maybe I'd heard him wrong. "Did you say peregrines?" He held up the feather. "A peregrine falcon," he said. "They're amazing creatures. The fastest birds on Earth. They're like shapeshifters, the way they streamline their bodies in the air." The name was just a weird coincidence, but it left me with an uncanny feeling I couldn't shake. Over breakfast, I began to wonder if I'd given up too easily. Though it was true there was no one left alive whom I could talk to about my grandfather, there was still the house, a lot of it unexplored. If it had ever held answers about my grandfather, in the form of letters maybe, or a photo album or a diary, they'd probably burned up or rotted away decades ago. But if I left the island without making sure, I knew I'd regret it. And that is how someone who is unusually susceptible to nightmares, night terrors, the creeps, the willies, and seeing things that aren't really there, talks himself into making one last trip to the abandoned, almost certainly haunted house where a dozen or more children met their untimely end. End of chapter 4.